Chapter 1. The world was a mausoleum of frosted glass and skeletal branches when the call came. It was a poor thing, a tinny, desperate plea, swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence of the ancestral manor. Lord Kalin, the last of the coven of ash, stood before a leaded window, watching the dead light of a winter moon leach all color from the marble floor. His solitude was a polished, agonizing thing, earned by centuries of terrible choices and the silent, cold conviction that he was the only remaining anchor against the rising tide of the old ones. He did not move, not a flicker of the unnaturally still, pale hand resting on the chilled stone sill. Yet the sound of the waiter's choked voice, a nervous, common human, reverberated through his long-deceased heart. The message was absurdly simple, stark against the canvas of his ancient, burdened life. His estranged, mortal son, a reckless indulgence Kalin had long regretted and fiercely protected from a distance, was unconscious on a forgotten street in the lower district. The details were sparse and terrifying. There was no visible injury, only a profound, unnatural stillness, a sudden collapse that had happened right outside the cramped, greasy diner where the boy, Elias, spent his days proving he could live without his father's cursed, silvered protection. Kalen's lips, the same shade of faded rose as old blood, parted just enough to release a name, a silent, rasping utterance of the boy's identity that was more of a condemnation than a blessing. He was a vampire lord, a creature forged in the guilt of 1,000 years, bound by an ancient, ironclad oath to a world that both reviled and needed him. But Elias, his brief, fragile venture into mortality, was the wound that would not close. The call ended with a sudden, panicked click, leaving Kalin suspended in the stark light. The manor's silence deepened, becoming a heavy, expectant presence. The air, already frigid, seemed to drop another 10 degrees, a physical manifestation of Kalen's instantaneous, terrifying shift from mournful philosopher to lethal predator. He was driven by a guilt so deep it had become the marrow in his bones, a profound loneliness only amplified by the existence of the son he could not claim, the son he knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and prophetic, was now entangled in a danger far exceeding the usual mortal threats, the quiet hope he always carried, that Elias might simply live a full, warm, human life, had just been cruelly extinguished. Kalin turned, his movement a liquid grace that defied the laws of physics, his long black coat dissolving into the shadows. He did not need to ask the human waiter where the street was. A sudden, cold flare in his consciousness, a strange magnetic pull, told him the exact coordinates. This was not a simple accident. This was a summoning, a lure, a consequence of Elias's bloodline finally asserting its terrible, hidden cost. Kalen's inner world, usually a landscape of disciplined, ancient melancholy, was now a tense, high-stakes storm. He was fiercely protective, a terrifying force of nature awakened by the vulnerability of his kin. He vowed in the echoing silence of the manor that nothing, not the ancient enemies, not the treacherous covenants, and certainly not the consequences of his own history, would take this fragile, defiant piece of his heart. The drive through the city was a blur of Gothic spires and cold streetlights, Kalen's focus absolute, his jaw tight. The city was always a reflection of its dark rulers, beautiful, dangerous, and hiding 1,000 secrets beneath its cobblestone veneer. The scent of rain, ash, and impending snow filled the air, a fitting stage for the drama about to unfold. He knew, with a certainty that tasted like fear and old power, that his life of isolated penance was over. The game had just begun, and the stakes were not just Elias's life, but the fragile peace of the entire supernatural world. He pushed the accelerator, the engine a low, predatory growl beneath him. He was coming for his son, a dark god returning to claim his own, and the sheer force of his protective intent seemed to crack the very air around the speeding car. His final, terrible thought before arriving was the chilling realization that Elias was not merely unconscious. He was inert, an empty vessel, a beacon shining with an unknown, dangerous light. Chapter 2. The lower district street was a narrow, forgotten gash in the city's underbelly, smelling of stale grease, damp concrete, and something far older and colder, the scent of unleashed, primordial power. Kalen's black, silent luxury car stopped abruptly. He stepped out, a figure of dramatic, inhuman stillness against the backdrop of flickering neon and winter fog. He moved with a sparse, purposeful grace, his eyes, the color of polished obsidian in the meager light, sweeping the area. He saw the poor, trembling waiter leaning against the diner's grimy window, a silhouette of nervous tension, but his focus snapped to the prone figure in the alleyway opening. Elias. The boy was lying unnaturally still, his face pale and slack against the dirty pavement. Kalen approached, his boots silent on the wet ground. The sight of his son, stripped of his usual defensive sarcasm and vital energy, struck him with a physical force, a sharp, cold jab of guilt and fierce, protective rage. Elias's collapse was not merely fainting, it was a profound, mystical shutdown. A quiet hope, that small flame Kalen carried, threatened to be snuffed out by the overwhelming reality of the scene. As Kalen knelt, disregarding the filth, he took in the details that the mortal waiter could not perceive. The air around Elias shimmered, an almost invisible field of frantic, chaotic energy. It was raw power, unrefined and terrifyingly massive, the kind of latent force that could split mountains or shatter the ancient covenants that kept the supernatural world hidden. It was his power, amplified and distorted by his mother's long-forgotten, hidden lineage, finally breaking free of its mortal restraints. His hand hovered over Elias's chest, the marble skin of his fingers sensitive to the slightest shift in the boy's internal temperature. Elias was cold, too cold, a chilling counterpart to Kalen's own deathless state. He could not find a wound, no bite, no external mark, only the evidence of a catastrophic internal event. He had to get Elias to the manor, to the sealed, magically reinforced sanctum where the Coven of Ashes' ancient healing rituals might have a chance against whatever had been unleashed. The immediate threat, however, was not the boy's condition, but the palpable, magnetic nature of his power. It was a beacon. Kalen stood, towering over the unconscious boy, his stance a silent declaration of war against any entity that dared to approach. His emotional tone was a terrifying mixture of melancholy and tension, driven by the fierce urgency of the moment. He looked at the waiter, who now stammered something about calling the police. Kalen's voice, when it came, was a low, formal whisper of absolute authority, a sound that carried the weight of ages and the promise of immediate oblivion. You will forget what you saw. The boy had a brief, mortal seizure. You saw nothing else. Go back inside. Forget. The command was laced with an ancient, subtle compulsion that would ensure the human's compliance, weaving a veil of selective amnesia over the traumatic event. The waiter, already overwhelmed by the sight of Kalen, a figure of impossible Gothic beauty and raw, quiet power, nodded dumbly, retreating into the diner's harsh light like a moth fleeing a shadow. Kalen did not watch him go. His focus was entirely on Elias. He scooped his son up. Elias was light, impossibly so, a fragile, breakable thing in Kalen's ancient, powerful arms. The close-up focus on this physical contact, the pale, smooth marble skin of the father supporting the vulnerable, mortal warmth of the son, was a visceral manifestation of their entire, impossible relationship. As Kalen turned to leave, his keen, supernatural senses caught a whisper on the wind, a secondary scent overriding the urban decay. It was the heavy, sweet, and sour perfume of a rival coven's ancient dark magic, the unmistakable signature of the Crimson Court. They had been watching, waiting, and now they had acted, using Elias's inherited power as a weapon, a lure, or perhaps even a terrible prize. Kalen's breath caught, a silent internal gasp that felt like a betrayal. His eyes narrowed, the obsidian deepening to a lightless void. The high-stakes escalation was already upon them. This was no longer just about guilt and protection. It was about ancient politics, the fragile balance of power, and a son who was unknowingly a weapon of mass, supernatural destruction. The short, impactful dialogue with the waiter was over. Now only the long, desperate drive to the safety of the manor remained, and the certainty that they were being hunted. Chapter 3. The drive back was an exercise in pure, terrifying discipline. Kalen's mind, usually a fortress of logical, centuries-old thought, was a storm of strategic planning and agonizing fear. He drove at impossible speeds, the black car a shadow blur through the Gothic labyrinth of the city. Elias lay across the back seat, seemingly peaceful, yet the chaotic energy radiating from him pulsed faster with every mile they put between themselves and the lower district. The scent of the Crimson Court's dark magic still clung to the air, a chilling reminder of their active interest. Kalen knew their methods. They would not pursue immediately, but instead set subtle, arcane traps, tripwires of blood magic and spectral sentinels, designed to delay him and draw him into a lethal public confrontation. He began to enact countermeasures, a silent, complex weaving of his own, older coven of ash protections. He mentally carved ancient glyphs of warding onto the tires, the windshield, and the engine block, drawing on the reservoir of quiet, powerful mercy he had cultivated over centuries. The language style shifted within his inner monologue, becoming poetic and highly descriptive, reflecting the deep emotional state and the grandeur of the magic he was wielding. He saw the city as a visual metaphor, a colossal, indifferent beast, its alleys like skeletal ribs, its high towers like watchful, judgmental eyes. Elias, in his unnaturally still repose, was the eye of the storm. Kalen's internal conflict, trust and choice versus survival and ancient politics, was raging. He had shielded Elias from the truth of his heritage for 2 decades, hoping that ignorance might grant him a normal life. Now, that ignorance was the very thing that made him vulnerable. His guilt was a sharp, constant pressure. He had failed his oath to keep the boy completely untouched. Yet a quiet hope persisted. Elias had not simply died. He was in stasis, a pupa of raw, unfathomable power. This suggested a transformation, not a demise, a choice being made by the ancient blood itself. The sentence style in Kalen's thoughts contrasted sharply. The long, sensory-rich descriptions of the ritualistic defenses were interspersed with short, impactful realizations. They want him whole. They need his power. They will not stop. The manor finally appeared, a silent, colossal monument of black stone and age, nestled deep within a thicket of ancient bone-white oaks. Its windows, dark and deep, watched their approach like the sockets of a terrible skull. The iron gate swung open silently, automatically answering to Kalen's psychic command, a welcome that felt more like a ceiling than an entry. Inside the foyer, beneath a chandelier that had not held real candles in a century, Kalen carried Elias up the grand, sweeping staircase. The air here was heavy with the scent of age and cold marble, a familiar, comforting chill that only magnified the unsettling heat radiating from the boy's body. He took Elias to the sanctum, a tower room shielded by layers of intricate, forgotten spells, its walls covered in tapestries that depicted the brutal, beautiful history of the Coven of Ash. He gently laid Elias on the altar-like stone slab at the room's center. It was a place for initiation, for healing, and, if all else failed, for a final, merciful end. Kalen stood back, his face a mask of sculpted stone and fierce protection. He began the initial diagnostic ritual, a simple, painful casting of light. A thin, silvery thread of pure magic emanated from his finger, tracing the contour of Elias's collapsed form. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The thread did not simply analyze, it was violently repelled by the chaotic, internal storm, shattering into a million shimmering motes that fell like silent, magical ash. This raw power was beyond any known coven control. Kalen was forced to the chilling realization that Elias was no longer a human waiting to be saved. He was an event waiting to happen. The final, critical piece of the puzzle slid into place. The waiter had said Elias was simply unconscious, but the boy's blood was singing a complex, destructive anthem. He wasn't merely out cold, he was experiencing a forced, premature awakening, a violent and uncontrolled activation of the Eterna Sanguis, the eternal blood that ran through his veins. Chapter 4. Kalen spent the next hour locked within the sanctum, a figure of dramatic stillness surrounded by the violent hum of unchecked power. His movements were sparse and purposeful, his concentration absolute as he attempted to stabilize the maelstrom within Elias. The atmosphere in the room was electric, the tapestries on the wall faintly vibrating with the boy's internal chaos. Kalen rejected all known healing spells of his coven. They were designed for the measured, disciplined power of vampires, not for this untamed, mortal-born eruption. His hands, pale and fine, moved in intricate patterns over Elias, seeking an anchor, a fragile thread of mortality he could still grasp. His language style became intensely formal, the internal narration focused on the philosophical conflict of mercy versus nature. Was it an act of mercy to cage this power, to force his son back into the fragile shell of a human life? Or was it merely delaying the inevitable, denying the boy his terrifying, fated nature? The answer was a grim silence in the echoing room. He activated the sanctum's greatest defense, the veritas obscura, the dark truth. This was a deep, invasive magical probe, intended to cut through the layers of chaos and reveal the source of the affliction. He placed one hand on Elias's forehead and the other over his heart, closing his obsidian eyes. The close-up focus on this physical contact was critical. It was the ultimate, high-stakes vulnerability, both for the father giving and the son receiving. The moment the probe engaged, Kalen was violently pulled into Elias's consciousness, not as a calm observer, but as a horrified participant. The internal landscape of his son's mind was not unconscious darkness, but a blinding, overwhelming void of raw, nascent creation. There, suspended in the black, was a second figure, a shimmering, feminine shape of pure light and terrifying conviction. It was a seer, a creature of prophecy and immense power, whose image was indelibly marked onto Elias's soul like a brand. The seer was isolated, caught in the catastrophic power surge, yet she was actively battling the forces that had been unleashed. Kalen saw her face, framed by waves of impossible light, her emotional tone one of immense conviction and utter exhaustion. Her lips moved, forming words that echoed in the metaphysical space. The anchor. I needed an anchor. He chose to save me. The mystery reveal was blinding. Elias had not merely collapsed. He had stumbled upon this seer, likely a target of the Crimson Court, and in a moment of pure, mortal empathy, had used his latent, explosive power to shield her, becoming her anchor, her conduit, and now her prison. Kalen was violently ejected from the vision, gasping a silent, supernatural breath. The floor of the sanctum was cold beneath his knees. Elias was the same, still, inert, but the internal chaos was now centered, focused entirely around the luminous, trapped spirit of the seer. Kaelin recognized the seer's signature. She was from a long-lost line of prophetic humans, rumored to have been exterminated by the Coven of Ash centuries ago. His own ancestors' guilt, another terrible knot in his lineage. The irony was a bitter taste. The political thriller aspect escalated instantly. The Crimson Court was hunting the seer. She had found refuge in Kaelin's son. Kaelin was now bound to protect her as well, not just by an ancient oath to the world, but by the fierce, terrifying protective drive he felt for Elias's selfless choice. His emotional tone was now fiercely protective and driven by an impossible, quiet hope. He had to separate the seer from Elias without shattering the boy's fragile mind, an action that would require more power and control than he had ever wielded. The only way was to communicate, to use dialogue to reveal deep, world-changing information. He had to reach the seer through the metaphysical connection, to convince her that she was safe and that his own ancient power was a force for mercy, not destruction. Chapter 5. Kaelin initiated the delicate, dangerous procedure for metaphysical contact. He did not touch Elias this time. Instead, he drew upon the deepest reserves of his own, ancient power, weaving a shroud of Coven of Ash magic, old, disciplined, and focused, around the entire sanctum. The room darkened, the candlelight guttering, emphasizing the stark contrast between light and shadow, and lending a visual cue of immense, controlled energy. He pushed his consciousness across the chasm, not with the brutal force of the Veritas Obscura, but with the calculated, gentle pressure of a declaration of intent. He addressed the shimmering entity in Elias's mind, his voice a low, formal whisper that echoed only in the silent void of the metaphysical connection. Seer, I am Kaelin of Ash. You are bound to my son by his mercy, and his act is now an oath. I honor it. Speak to me. Tell me how to sever this without breaking him. The language was formal, sparse, and high value, used to immediately establish the stakes, his authority, and his promise. He was not asking for permission. He was demanding a path to their shared survival. The response from the seer was immediate, a voice of pure, melodic sorrow and conviction that cut through the chaos. She had withdrawn deeper into the protective cocoon of Elias's power, her form still luminous but fragile. Lord Kaelin, the price for an anchor is often the vessel. I am the prophecy unbound. He is a conduit of pure creation, a potential threat to your covenants, a prize for the crimson. The severance will shatter him. He must be stabilized, not cut free. Kaelin's heart, though undead, felt a terrible, heavy beat of realization. This was not a simple magical bonding. It was a fundamental chemical reaction between a fated seer and a latent Eterna Sanguis conduit. The rhetorical device of repetition was stark in the seer's declaration: price, vessel, threat, prize. The situation was far more dire than he had first assumed. The conversation continued, a high-value exchange of world-changing information. She revealed the details of the Crimson Court's ritual. They had intended to force her prophecy into a destructive, uncontrolled rampage, but Elias had inadvertently intercepted the blast, absorbing the power and the seer herself. She told Kaelin what only prophecy could know. They seek the three covenants, blood, shadow, and ash, to break the ancient seal on the old ones. My visions are the only counter. He anchored them to himself. He must become the shield, Lord Kaelin, not the wound. Kaelin understood instantly. Elias was a living, breathing paradox, a human who possessed the power to stabilize an apocalyptic seer, and by extension, the world. He was the anchor against the escalating threat. His own guilt and loneliness were momentarily forgotten in the face of this immense, shared burden. The choice was clear. He could not destroy the connection. He had to nurture it. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was steeped in the tense, fierce, protective tone of his being. Then we must stabilize the bond. Tell me the ritual, quickly. They are hunting you with intent to slaughter. You are now under the protection of the Coven of Ash by my son's choice, and I am bound to it. The seer's luminous form wavered, and a new, quiet hope entered her. Voice. She described a rare, forgotten ritual, a transfer of immense ancient energy, a deep, resonant merging of vampire and human power, an act of final, supreme trust that few vampires had ever survived. It was the only way to stabilize the human conduit, to grant Elias the control he needed. It required Kaelin to become a metaphysical bridge, absorbing the initial chaotic backlash and funneling his own pure sanguis aeterna into the seer and Elias simultaneously. It would drain him to the brink of true death, but it would save his son and the world. He looked down at Elias, at the boy's pale, vulnerable face. Choice, Kaelin thought, the thematic word echoing the entire arc of his existence. He had made 1,000 terrible choices, driven by survival and guilt. This was the first, and possibly the last, driven by pure, protective love. So be it, he whispered to the silence. If I am to be an anchor, let me anchor everything. Chapter 6. Kaelin began the stabilization ritual immediately. There was no time for hesitation, no room for his characteristic melancholy. The pressure of the impending siege from the Crimson Court was a palpable weight in the manor. He stripped down to his ceremonial vestments, exposing the intricate, faded scars on his marble-smooth chest, ancient glyphs of power and suffering carved into his immortal skin. The visual cue prompts were stark. The contrast of light and shadow, the unnatural stillness of the vampire lord preparing for a final, catastrophic expenditure of power. He positioned himself over the inert form of Elias, hovering just above the boy's chest, allowing the chaotic energy to flood into him, using his own ancient, disciplined form as a metaphysical filter. The ritual demanded a total, high-stakes vulnerability. The first contact was a shockwave. The power of the Aeterna Sanguis within Elias, mixed with the raw prophetic energy of the seer, was 1,000 times greater than Kaelin's estimate. It hit him like a physical blow, a brutal fusion that felt like his ancient essence was being violently shredded. He choked back a scream that would have shattered the sanctum's wards, his jaw clenched so tightly that his fangs, usually barely visible, pressed deep into his lip, drawing a line of his own. Precious blood. He allowed the blood to fall onto Elias's forehead, a final, necessary ingredient to the ritual, the tangible promise of his life, his power, and his oath. The sensory overload was agonizing, the searing heat of the energy, the scent of his own blood mixing with the dust of ages, the crushing pressure of the metaphysical chaos. He began to chant, the words not of a known language, but of the ancient, forgotten tongue of his coven, a language sparse and purposeful, capable of reshaping reality. The goal was to funnel his own, concentrated, stable life force, centuries of power, into the chaotic core. His essence poured out of him, a steady, silvery stream of light that dissolved into Elias. As Kaelin was emptied, his own form began to fail. His marble skin grew taut, paper-thin, his eyes dulling from obsidian to a flat, dusty gray. He was fading, approaching the brink of true death, the oblivion that even the most powerful vampires feared. But the act was working. Within Elias, the chaos began to recede. The seer's luminous form, visible only to Kaelin, solidified, becoming a centered, stable light. Elias's body, too, responded. The unnatural stillness broke. A shallow, ragged breath escaped his lips, followed by a slight tremor in his fingers. The moment of stability arrived suddenly, violently. The connection snapped, the metaphysical bridge collapsing, leaving Kalen suspended in an agonizing void of exhaustion. He collapsed, not with a crash, but with a slow, agonizing slide, his powerful form now a weightless husk on the cold floor beside the altar. Elias coughed, a deep, visceral sound, and then his eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes Kalen remembered. They were clearer, wiser, and held a faint, residual shimmer of the seer's light. Elias sat up slowly, his movement no longer clumsy, but imbued with a strange, liquid grace. He looked down at his father, the fallen lord, the marble skin pale and slack, the ancient power spent. His expression was a complex mixture of shock, dawning terror, and a sudden, profound understanding that transcended their previous, strained relationship. He saw Kalen not as a distant, guilty father, but as an exhausted God, broken by an act of absolute, protective mercy. The dialogue was high value, intimate, and delivered with a new, quiet conviction that was utterly unlike the rebellious boy Kalen had known. Elias's first words were not a question, but a statement of recognition and acceptance. The anchor holds, Father. You have sealed us all. They are at the gate. What is the next command? The final rhetorical device was complete. The son, once the burden, was now a powerful, fully realized figure of immense conviction, speaking formally, using the ancient terminology of their world. Kalen looked up, his vision swimming, yet his spirit soaring with a quiet, fierce triumph. The high-stakes escalation was now a siege. He managed a single, rasping word, his tone tense and fiercely protective, driven now by the strength of his son. We survive.